And so I'm happy to do that.
Okay. Good, good. Yeah, well, we have a lot of receipts and evidence we always have to put in here. So, yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
And I signed up for in the morning. They have a speed dating thing, kind of a speed networking thing, for the morning. I ended up being sick last year. I missed the event, and so I'm looking forward to this year, to kind of getting reconnected. So, and it's come
Well,
back in attendance. Remember, the pandemic kind of knocked it down. Now it's back up to like the 4 or 5 thousand attendees. So it's going to be good.
yeah, people want to know what's happening, So, any chance you get to kind of hear from, the electeds or some of the, business leaders around the island, it's always a good draw.
Good, good. Very good. All right, we're gonna. Hey, everyone out there. Bob Harrison from the Stony Brook Small Business Development Center. I'm a business advisor here. We're gonna wait one more minute before we get started. Then I'm gonna do the introduction to our speaker Arthur that I've been talking with here, and we'll kick things off. This is like a really important area. When I had my company and we had space inside a parent company and then had to go out and expand and get more space and just all the details surrounding, getting a good lease agreement and checking all the boxes is going to be really valuable and important for you. So, so where are we? We're 9:03. So why don't we do this? Let me do the intro, and then we'll have Arthur take it away. And I think you're going to find this a real value add and insightful. So Arthur Yermash is a partner at Campolo, Middleton McCormick. CMM is a premier law firm with offices across Long Island. We were just talking about the space that they have down there right near Islip Airport. It's a nice venue. So Arthur is a commercial real estate lawyer who provides practical, business-focused guidance to clients. Arthur leads the firm's commercial leasing practice. He has experience in working with real estate decision makers for tenants and landlords on specific lease and business decisions, as well as real estate strategies. For more than 15 years, he directly supported the general counsel and legal and business teams of a national retailer. In addition, he has worked with property owners, management teams, and legal departments in connection with broad real estate matters, serving as a go-to resource and primary outside counsel on a wide range of legal and real estate matters. Recently, Arthur developed portfolio renegotiation strategies for multiple national and regional retailers, which were implemented to renegotiate lease terms for thousands of retail locations. Boy, I tell you, Arthur, when I read that, I think of Sears and how the guy took over and it basically ended up being a real estate play. He put no money into stores, it was all real estate. So, anyway, I'm
Yeah.
sure you'll share some interesting stories along the way. But Arthur Yermesh, please go ahead.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you to the Stony Brook Small Business Development Center. You know, uh, Happy to be a part of this series that you guys tend to put on, and I think it's always important to connect with folks that are at different levels of their business journey, whether they're starting out and kind of looking at a lot of different things and trying to get their plan in place, as well as people that have been in business for many years that are either growing or downsizing and being able to connect and talk about some of the stuff that we're seeing, as well as to provide some insight, is always, I think, helpful. And so today we're going to talk about uh, commercial occupancy, right? And the work that I do on a day-to-day basis is, really really kind of wide ranging. We have clients that I work with that are landlords that own office buildings, that own shopping centers. And so we work with them on their leases and making sure that they're able to, be profitable and keep their tenants in the space and paying rent. At the same time, I work with many businesses that lease space, right? That, whether at the retail level, like storefronts or in shopping malls or shopping centers, or office buildings or commercial centers. So I always like to kind of talk about it from a lot of different perspectives, to really uh, give as broad of of information as I could, with the hope that, anyone sitting there listening could at least take some piece away that, would be helpful to them. Um, so I will say, feel free to jump in with any questions. If anything comes up as I'm speaking, I'm more than happy to kind of pause and answer questions. I think it tends to be more helpful and interactive when we're able to just address things in real time. Sometimes, people that wait around till the end, you might forget your question or whatever. But if there's something that I'm talking about that you either want me to expand on or want to ask about, feel free to jump in anytime and interrupt. More than happy to address it as we're going through. And I also will say, I probably will jump around a bit topics. So if you want me to kind of get into something any more specifically, again, feel free to just jump in. So what we're talking about today is the cost of renting commercial real estate, right? And a lot of times when people are looking at leasing commercial space, again, whether it's for office purposes or warehouse purposes or a storefront, the thing that everybody focuses on is what is the base rent, right? What is the annual rent, right? And we refer to, the monthly rent that you pay in a lot of different ways, but base rent is, tends to be more common, right? And even a lot of the brokers that advertise space out there or that, talk to people about it, the focus is always about base rent, and that could be quoted either in a per square foot type of number or just a rental monthly amount. But what I always try to get folks to think about is you know base rent is one small piece of the puzzle of what it costs to be in a commercial space. Um, Besides base rent, landlords look to pass along their operating costs, right? Because as an owner of a commercial real estate property, the goal is to be out of pocket as little as possible and have the tenants pick up all the cost. And so some landlords will, you know, will market space where they where the base rent is all inclusive, right? It encompasses everything, and you know exactly what you're paying every month. But I would tell you that that's not the common approach, right? I think a lot of landlords in marketing spaces prefer to show a lower base rent and then charge a bunch of additional other things that tenants are responsible for. And the most common are insurance, operating expenses, and taxes, right? And we'll talk about that, in more specifics. And I will say that a lot of the stuff is negotiable, right? When people see advertised space, it's always important to ask these types of questions. What else am I paying besides the base rent? And making sure that anybody who's looking at space is well aware of how that's structured, what that looks like, and really what their expenses are, not only day one, but year five or year 10, and thinking through really the future now, because once you're in it, it's very hard to renegotiate, right? And we do plenty of renegotiating when either things aren't going well or someone's looking to expand and things are going great. But you want to really give yourself as much leverage and as much protection as possible at the beginning of the relationship, so that when you are down the road and you need something from the landlord, whether it's more space or maybe it's some sort of break, that you're at least in a good position to be able to leverage the existing terms to negotiate for something. So what we'll talk about is what are the hidden costs, right? What is it that we're not, that is not obvious to see when considering leasing space. Um, and the reason it's important is because the market is constantly changing, right? I think and I think the COVID example of things is we've been talking about it for quite a few years now, but I think it's always important to kind of revisit it, right? One thing COVID did was it completely reworked office space modeling, right? Because uh, it created sort of an entire industry of work from home people, right? And so, what office building, some office buildings have suffered because of it, where tenants just don't need as much space, right? And so some have downsized, some that are stuck on in long-term leases, required people to come back to the office, as a pressure point on because of the lease, and so making sure that you're thinking about the total cost and what that flexibility could look like in a lease is important now more than ever. I think when COVID happened, a lot of uh, you know a lot of companies that operate in offices had to really a lot of them got caught flat-footed, right? Because they're in these expensive leases that are long term, sometimes 5, sometimes 10 years, and they had a bunch of people that just wouldn't show up, right? So the space would be vacant, and it would just be a big cost, and people, and companies had to spend money to adapt to work from home and whatever else, and they're stuck in these long term leases. So kind of now with that in mind, thinking ahead, I think is an important part of it. And also, obviously, business cost is always a key part of trying to get to being profitable, right? And making sure costs are managed well, that there are no surprises, and really understanding what the lease framework is critical to that. And again, from a landlord's perspective, they're focused on, how do I make the most money out of my real estate property, right? And so landlords want as low risk as possible, as little liability as possible, and making sure that the tenants are responsible for everything, right? So all the carrying costs, all the operational costs, you know, cleaning the building, replacing the roof, all that stuff. Landlords want to come out as little as possible out of pocket and and frequently try to pass the costs along to tenants. And making sure we're just focused and aware of that is an important part of it, because I'm not saying there's anything wrong with landlords wanting to do that. But if I'm going into a lease where I think, hey, look, my base rent is $20 a square foot, so I'm paying, let's say, $2,000 a month, you know, that's not the full story, right? And really making sure we're focused on it, and thinking about that stuff before entering into a lease is very important. Um, so let's get into some of the details. So base rent, I mentioned it. That's just what the fixed amount is that you're paying every month, right? The most common framework is you agree to base rent as to what it is day one. Commonly, it would increase every year, and you know exactly what that's going to look like from day one through the end of the term. I will mention that a lot of leases that we work on have tenant renewal options, right? And uh, determining base rent, what is fair and reasonable 5 years from now or 10 years from now, with uncertain real estate markets, often has landlords pushing for what we refer to as fair market value rent. That is a process where, if the tenant exercises an option to renew the lease, then the landlord will want to, instead of just continuing regular increases, to essentially reset the base rent that the lease is for, and and making sure that you're focused on what that process looks like, to understand, well, will the landlord just be able to decide what the rent is because the that's what the market is, so, and sometimes that's how leases are structured, but often we're able to negotiate a more uh, fair process where there's some exchange, right? Where the landlord could say, look, the market rent for this space is now this, you're only paying that. Let's come up with some process, and there's some back and forth that goes into that. That's something to think about and plan for. So beyond base rent is tenant improvement and build out costs, right? So when someone is entering into a new space, and that could be, you know, any type of commercial space, what is it going to cost to get the space up and running and open for business, right? With I think office buildings, this tends to be, probably on the less expensive side. But depending on the type of business, whether it's some sort of unique use, or whether it's a bakery, or whether it's a candy shop, right? Everything looks, when people start their business, they want things to be their way, right? And figuring out what it's going to cost to be able to do that is a critical part of it, right? As everybody who's ever done any construction knows, nothing's ever what it seems, right? Things takes time. Sometimes permits get delayed. You're paying rent while you're waiting to get approved for a building permit. You're waiting for the town to approve signage, right? And all these different things, they take up time, and they take up a lot of money, right? So really planning for it, and and the reason I mentioned now is that this is stuff that you could plan for within the lease framework, right? So to give you an example, one of the leases that I'm working on right now for a client, we are, the tenant is doing a bunch of very unique construction work in the space. And so anticipating that it's going to take a long time to get it done, that they'll need special approval from town and village and county to do exactly what they want to do. We negotiated sort of free rent that's broken up over the initial year and a half of the lease, where every few months the tenant doesn't have to pay base rent, right? So that gives the tenant some cash flexibility to be able to navigate, the timing that is going to cost. And we built into that analysis, possible delays, and you kind of have to plan for the worst case scenario, and really understanding what that will look like before signing a lease is important, so that you're not just paying rent while you're waiting for months at a time to get up and running. Um, Beyond that is what we in the lease tend to refer to additional rent. It's sort of a term of art, and it comes from some case law that's been around for decades, right? Because anything that is paid under a lease is the reason it's referred to as additional rent is because uh, rent that's paid under a lease is enforceable and collectible by landlords under the landlord-tenant court framework, right? So if there's some payment obligation that is not referred to as additional rent, it actually forces the landlord to file a regular lawsuit if it's not paid. And so, some really, really smart attorneys, years and years ago came up with this concept. Well, you know, let's just call it additional rent because it's, we'll make it rent also, and then we could, landlords could recover it easily if a tenant doesn't pay it. So that's sort of the funny kind of background as to where the term, rent, additional rent comes from. And so, a lot of times you will see in leases, you have your base rent and then you have additional rent, which is like also rent, right? And that tends to include taxes. And, we'll talk about taxes, in more detail, but the most common framework for taxes in a lease is that tenant pays increases, annual increases in taxes on the building over a certain base rent period, right? And we often negotiate what the base rent period is. We and the rationale there is that base rent is essentially already includes the current taxes, right? So landlords kind of price it in when they determine base rent, but as taxes go up, they want tenants to be responsible for their share of the taxes on the building, and that's probably the most common framework that we tend to see in commercial leases. Also, landlords tend to have insurance expenses, right, to make sure that the building is insured for any damage or destruction, or anybody getting hurt at or around the property, and so the cost of insurance is usually passed on to tenants. Common area maintenance is what we refer to commonly in leases as the cost that a landlord incurs for the operation and maintenance of the building, right? So depending on how big the building is, that may be a larger cost or a smaller cost. And again, that's something that landlords tend to pass down to tenants, and we'll talk about how that's typically structured. And then the day-to-day cleaning, security, parking, everything else, we sort of throw that in. That tends to be part of additional rent as well. And and for tenants, it's important to understand what those costs include, and more importantly, what we want to exclude from those costs, right? And we'll talk about what that is.
Hey, Arthur, I had a quick
Yeah,
question for you.
yeah, of
When
course.
we had our lease on our building, we actually took over an existing lease, from a company, and the landlord had a provision in there that, about escalating taxes that we would pay a share of because we split the building with him.
Yep.
And he also had a provision in there about grieving the taxes that could be adjusted. Just any comments, on things we should check, that
Yeah,
kind of.
yeah. So this is, you bring up a, pretty interesting issue because, uh, and I'll try to explain this because, it's always difficult to explain, but I'll try to explain the nuance as it relates to taxes and when landlords grieve them, right? So the typical framework is, as a tenant, you are paying increases over base year taxes, right? So let's say we determine that we start the lease today. Base year taxes are the taxes that are due from, July of 25 through June of 26, right? So whatever the taxes are now, you're paying whatever they will increase to going forward. And so you know exactly what they are today, and when when the the local municipality issues the new tax bill, it'll be obvious to know what the increase is because you know the base year amount today, and you know the increase when it comes out. Now, what happens a lot of times is that landlords will grieve the taxes for past years, right? So they already paid the taxes for this year, but let's say next year they decide, you know what, I overpaid, I should have paid less, and there's framework for challenging the amount that was assessed. And though, a lot of times it's a court process where the landlord actually files an action in court, and very very common thing that happens in the real estate world, especially in Nassau County. Nassau County is huge on tax grievances. I think Suffolk is a little, it's less of a thing because I just don't think there's a lot of legal framework for it as much as there is in Nassau. But nonetheless, it's something that does happen quite frequently. And what happens is, let's say a couple of years from now, landlord grieves the base year taxes, right? And so let's say the taxes this year were $100 as an example, and landlord grieves taxes a couple of years from now, and retroactively that base tax amount goes from $100 to, let's say, $80, right? So now the base year is reduced, and the effect is that the increase that you're paying as a tenant over the base year actually goes up, right? Because your base goes down, and so the delta with the increases for next year's taxes is going to be greater, right? So if went up to $120 from 100, now mathematically it'll be like it went from $80 to $120, right? And so it actually costs tenants a lot more when the base year taxes are grieved by landlords and reduced. And so a lot of times we look to protect tenants against that type of unanticipated scenario, right? Because it's such a nuanced thing that, unless you deal with this on a regular basis, you really wouldn't really expect or think about that occurring, right? It kind of, just a small thing that's not particularly common, but we always look to make sure that we have some language in our lease for tenants saying that even if the landlord grieves taxes, it will not impact the base year for purposes of calculating tenants' increases, right? So the effect is, even if the taxes are lower, we're not going to mess with the base year to screw up our increase determination. And so that's one small nuance that we try to make sure to identify. So, Bob, to your to your example, if there is a grievance, that's something to be mindful of. How will it affect the cost of your increases going forward? Um, So, kind of jumping into common area maintenance, and this is what landlords pass along to tenants as their general operating expenses, right? And what these include are really all the things that it takes to run the building, keep it operational, keep it in good order. And the costs for this really vary from building to building, right? Uh, some buildings, but let's say, to use an example, office building tend to be given sort of class ratings, right? So you might see a building advertised a class A building, you might see a building advertised a class B building. Um, and the difference tends to be how much is the landlord spending to make the building nice, and there's certain, mandatory things in terms of safety and stuff like that. But we're talking about, you know, is the landscaping nice? Is the parking lot in good shape? Is there sufficient parking for everybody, and making sure that, even though the landlord is spending that money, they're charging that back to the tenants, right? And um, being mindful, and a lot of times in commercial space advertising, you will see, some sort of common area maintenance charge being quoted, right? But keep in mind that fluctuates, right? So, snow is a great example, right? That we've kind of seen over the last few years. The previous, let's say, 3 years, landlords across the island did not spend a lot of money on snow removal, right? There just wasn't any snow. And so that, resulted in some savings to tenants because their common area maintenance was lower because of that, right? This past year, right, this past winter, as everybody saw, the snow really came hard and heavy, right, on multiple occasions. And so, we're expecting that the cost that the landlords, incurred this year for snow removal will increase people's CAM charges next year, right? And so being mindful that these things fluctuate, that these things increase depending on what's happening, I think that's something to be mindful of. And it's not unusual for tenants to ask, well, what have been the common charges for the last few years? I'd like to know, I understand I'm being charged based on last year's amounts today, but I want to know, what have the increases looked like? What is money spent on? And really, just like landlords evaluate tenants, right? They ask for their financial information. They ask for their ability to pay rent. They want to know what their business is going to be doing. It's totally not unreasonable for tenants to ask those types of questions of landlords to make sure that they're evaluating the building and what they're going to be paying as as a lease expense. So to touch on proportionate share, this is something that's common in leases. A lot of times, tenants are responsible. Hold on, was there somebody commenting in the chat?
Yes,
Okay, we got
someone
it.
just said,
Yep.
could a landlord refuse to disclose those financials?
So the answer is yes. Happens all the time. Landlords like to keep that type of stuff close to the vest, and create as much uncertainty as possible so that they could just send the bill. But also, a lot of times, what a typical lease would have is uh, audit rights, right? So, this is something that, depending on the landlord, so a lot of times it depends on the landlord. I think is ultimately what the answer is. Some of the more larger landlords, like real estate trusts or shopping mall owner type landlords, they have a very organized process where they charge tenants what they charge. They provide the supporting information for how the costs were calculated. They might not provide every single bill, but they at least provide a breakdown of how the common area maintenance and what costs were incurred as part of that are passed down to tenants. What tenants are able to negotiate for in leases is audit rights, right? And what that looks like a lot of times, and this is probably more common in the retail space than office space, because Retail tends to have more expenses, especially in shopping centers, because there are a lot of grounds to cover, to maintain, and stuff like that. And so tenants are able to negotiate for the ability to audit landlord's determination of common area maintenance costs, right? Where the landlord provides their analysis of the costs with bills, and then tenant has the right to audit it. And if landlord mischarged them or charged them too much, or uh, uh, let's say if what's common to having a lease is if the landlord charged too much over a certain percentage, let's say 5 to 10% is where the market tends to be on what the threshold is, then landlord is responsible for the audit cost that it took to figure out that they were wrong. Now, a lot of times in my experience, this is used more as leverage, right? So rarely are tenants going to really dig in and spend a lot of time challenging how the landlord determined their cost, and whether it's fair, whether it's not fair. But the just being able to negotiate for that, and if the landlord gives in to at least some version of some audit right, it at least helps keep the landlord honest in how they're going to pass the cost along. And I will say that the framework tends to get very complicated on some of the larger leases that we do, because we get into a lot of detail about what is included in common area maintenance and what should be excluded, right? So the common battleground for stuff like this is uh, capital expenditures, right? So we have the day-to-day operating costs and all that, and everybody I think agrees that those are commonly passed down to tenants. Where things get a little more tricky is capital improvements, which are major improvements that improve the value of a real estate property, right? So for example, let's say the building needs a roof replacement, or let's say the building needs a brand new parking lot completely repaved, right? Those are you know depending on the size of the building, could be huge costs, from hundreds of thousands of dollars to multi-million dollar improvement projects. And uh, a lot of leases have language around, is that something that should be passed down to tenants, right? And the battleground negotiation on that issue really comes down to a tenant position is typically that, well, this is something that improves the value of the building. So the landlord is benefiting by doing this cost. The landlord, often would get some sort of tax rebate for doing an improvement like that on a major scale. And so it wouldn't be fair for the tenant to have to pay for that, and the landlord getting a windfall in the increased value of the property. And landlords tend to argue back, saying, well, the tenant's getting a benefit, they're getting a better building, and blah blah blah. And so a lot of times that does get negotiated. The most common approach is that capital expenditures that improve the building are typically excluded from being a tenant pass-through expense. But again, that's where the devil's in the details, right? And is the lease clear on that, or could a landlord say, oh, you know what, I'm going to replace the roof and I'm going to have the tenants pay for it because I'm allowed to under the lease, and I have a bunch of tenants that signed stuff I gave them, didn't look at it, didn't negotiate it, and that's where some of these unexpected costs and dramatic increases in common area charges really come into play sometimes, and it does create tension from time to time. And yeah, and so the point I wanted to make on the audit right is also it often comes with a reconciliation, right? So where a tenant could audit the landlord's determination, was it calculated fairly, was the tenant's percentage applied accurately, right? And the tenant's percentage is really most often based on square footage, right? So if I have a building that's 100,000 square feet and I have four tenants each with 20 25,000 square feet, then each one is responsible for 25% of the expense, right? So that's the most common. Sometimes we might agree to some other framework with tenant responsibility, depending on who uses what services and whatever else. But that's the most common way to do it. And then, besides the order right, having the ability to reconcile and have an adjustment, right? So let's say the landlord overcharged last year, so we get a credit this year, right? And making sure that framework is clear and tight and just well put together is something to focus on. And so a couple of other things, to mention briefly, gross up provisions. I'll just mention it briefly, but happy to explain it, offline at some point. But that's where, it's a common issue in office buildings that aren't fully occupied, where landlords base cost of the common charges on what the cost would be as if the building was fully occupied, right? So it allows the landlord to probably recover a little more than what it is out of pocket during low vacancy times. And that's really to stabilize the building and keep it operational. And so, that tends to be a point of contention because, the tenant position as well. I don't want to pay more than what the actual cost is. And, to just give a brief example of it, let's say it costs, $100 to clean the building, right? When it's fully occupied, right? If half the building is occupied, let's say that cost goes down to $50. And so what the landlords will often do is charge more than the $50 that it actually costs when the building is not fully occupied, but some small amount less than full occupancy to, again, just maintain, steady framework of common charges. And, that does create some tension as well. Also, landlords often on common charges tack on an administrative or a management fee that tends to be somewhere, commonly, I would say anywhere from 5 to 20%. 20%, we're usually on behalf of tenant are able to negotiate that down. And it's really an upcharge, right? Like a bit of a profit center that the landlord takes on their costs, right? So they have all these costs and they're managing it. And so they're saying, well, we shouldn't just have the pass through. We should also get something extra for having to do all the work to keep all this together, right? And so negotiating that amount is where the landlord gets some go-ahead dollars. Capital expenditures I touched on, and then again focusing on what's excluded and what's included in the cost, right? And then just the last piece here is the audit windows and notice requirements are too short to be practical, right? So just making sure that if a tenant is able to negotiate for an audit right, that audit right is reasonable, right? Where it's not like, well, you have 15 days to review and let me know if you disagree, and if you don't tell me you disagree, then you waive any right to reconcile, right? So making sure that the timeline is something reasonable where a tenant could get an accountant to take a look at it, or even do it themselves, but having the right period of time to do that. And so all these things really are just small little nuances that really could add up to significant cost increases in a lease if they're not really thought about or handled carefully. So I'll touch on bullet point number 2 here because I think it's an important one. So the operating expenses in a commercial lease tend to be broken out into what's controllable and what's not controllable, right? And the difference is, operating any building of any size, there are costs that are going to be the same every year, right? You're going to have your taxes, you're going to have your utility costs. There are things that that the building is going to incur, but there are other costs that tend to fluctuate, right? So let's say how much landlord is spending to clean the building or other things like that, where they could increase or decrease services and charge more, right? And so things that the landlord has control over, it's not unusual to negotiate a cap on how much that could increase year to year, right? And so it really comes down to is if the tenant is has enough leverage to negotiate that's a good thing to negotiate, because then you're able to control exactly what the increases are year to year, and you just you have the you have insight into what that looks like as opposed to being surprised, as to what the increases look like. And again, requesting backup support, audit rights, and stuff like that. Um, so I want to. So end of lease costs is a really important issue that a lot of people don't think about when entering into a lease because your focus is, I like this space, I want to get into it, I like what it costs, I understand that I'm going to be charged extra amounts besides base rent, and so where do I sign and how do I get into it, right? But what a lot of people don't think about is, well, what happens when the lease ends, right? And that could be because it has naturally run its term and you want to be out of the space, the landlord doesn't want to renew it. But what happens at that end of term time, and what is the process for turning over the space, right? And depending on the use, this really, I've really seen this uh, dramatically impact decisions, especially for spaces that are not office spaces, right? Because for office spaces, they all tend to kind of be similar in some way, unless, you're building some, very unique space for your particular business. But, for office spaces, you have some rooms, you have conference rooms, and you put in your furniture, you take out your furniture, right? So that tends to be the most common framework there. For retail and other businesses, there's going to be a lot of stuff that you may want to build into your space to make your own, right? And so you do your construction, you put in your fixtures, you build in wall things, and there's all this stuff put into the space to make it your own. The question is, are you required to remove it when the lease ends, right? So not just, let's say, take all your furniture out, but do you have to change the lighting back to what it was when you got the space? Do you have to change the flooring, right? Sometimes landlords may require that at lease end, if you put in any particular flooring that they wanted to some base concrete, type of flooring that they delivered when the lease started. And, again, we're working with a tenant now where, they're going to they're building a lot of structures into the space. And, we had a very heavy duty negotiation on what do they have to remove at the end of it? What do they have to replace? What do they have to bring back to a certain condition? And really making sure we're focused on it now really helps us deal with it, let's say 10 or 20 years from now when, tenant is leaving the space and now they have a bunch of, thousands of dollars in costs that they have to put into a space that they're not going to be using anymore, that they have to plan for because they have to remove all their stuff, right? And making sure we're able to really understand what that looks like, especially if you're doing something unique into the space. And one example, we worked on an office lease that was a headquarters for a major company, right? And what the company wanted was this really grand sort of atrium entrance, right? That kind of spanned several floors. And they, put in these glass staircases. And it was very unique to their business, right? They wanted a certain look, wanted a certain feel to it. The landlord said, look, that's great. I'll even contribute some money to you guys doing what you want to do. But when the lease ends, I don't want this in the building because you're taking off floor space because now you have this grand entryway, this grand atrium that that works for you guys, but you took away, let's say, second floor and third floor space by opening up the entire ceiling, and that's not going to work for my next tenant when you guys leave the space. And so this was a heavy negotiation because that was something that to build out probably, was a couple of $1 million in construction work, but then to have to remove it when they leave, planning for, $1 million construction cost, for a space that you're leaving was sort of a huge thing to think about. Now, obviously that's on a large scale, but it doesn't, proportionately, all businesses that are leasing space will be affected by something like this. So planning for what happens at lease end is very important, and it shouldn't be sort of glossed over, especially if you're doing something unique or special to the space. So just kind of Bob, we have until 10 o'clock or 10:30. I just want to make sure I'm kind of managing time here.
Yeah, we usually go to about 10, but sometimes we go over a little bit depending on the questions,
Got it.
Q&A that comes up. I know I've got a couple things I want to ask about as we get toward the end, but yeah, that's our
Yep.
rough time frame.
Sure. Got it. All right. So so just kind of a couple of other things to mention is managing risk, right? So cost is one thing, and everyone ultimately could understand the cost, but really managing what liability is under a lease and what happens in a lot of different scenarios is an important part of thinking about a commercial space as well, right? So one common example is in a casualty situation, what happens if there's damage to the building, right? That could look like a lot of different things. It could be, a fire in the building. There could be, in a retail storefront, a car drives through a store window. That stuff does happen from time to time. Who's responsible and what happened, right? So, a typical commercial lease casualty provision will focus on whose insurance is responsible, right? And a lot of times it's going to be in a casualty event, it would probably be landlord's building insurance that would be responsible for it. But landlord a lot of times negotiates for the right to be able to decide whether they want to rebuild the space or not, right? And landlords could say, you know what, I'm not going to rebuild it. I'm just going to sell the building as is. And if I decide not to rebuild it, I'm terminating the lease, right? And that's what a lot of commercial landlords tend to negotiate for. So planning for that, making sure you're focused on it, where sometimes from the tenant perspective, depending on the size of the space and how critical it is to the building, we're able to negotiate for some protections, either requiring the landlord to rebuild it and getting free rent during the rebuilding period, or something else, and also allowing the tenant the right to terminate if they don't want to wait for the building to be put back together. Um, Maintenance costs, right? So who's responsible for repairing what? Typical commercial lease, tenant is responsible for everything that is within their space. Landlord will usually be responsible for maintaining the common areas, roof structure, that sort of thing. But making sure as a tenant that you are able to understand what is it going to cost for me to repair stuff in my space and keep it operational. That's an important thing to think about. Environmental issues. For shared office buildings, this is usually less of an issue. For single standing buildings that are fully occupied by a tenant, these could be huge issues, right? And on Long Island, there are a lot of stuff that happens underground where there is occasional contamination where the water underground gets contaminated, and there are a ton of regulatory framework about repairing that and remediating it and paying costs for the state to have to come in and deal with it. And that could be very, very costly if it's not properly handled under the lease framework, right? And typically, in working with tenants, what I like to focus on is, if the tenant has caused some sort of underground contamination, then the tenant is responsible for it. But if it was something that pre-existed before the tenant took possession of the space, or something that was caused through no fault of the tenant, then the tenant is not responsible, right? And this does get a little contentious negotiating this, because any landowner doesn't want to have to deal with a contamination issue, but as a tenant coming into a space that you may not know has some underground problems, you don't want to take on that risk either. This is, I have some information here about default, right? So understanding what a breach of a lease looks like is important, right? So, because that could be the difference between losing the space and being able to carefully manage, some business challenges, right? So, I'll give you an example that, this was something that we worked on for a major retailer a few years ago. They were, in severe financial distress. They couldn't pay rent. And so We went through hundreds of their leases to determine which leases have favorable uh, cure and default notice periods, right? In some cases, before a tenant is in default, landlord has to give a written notice, right? Send a notice saying, hey, you didn't pay your rent, you have to pay it in 5 days. Other leases don't require a landlord to send that notice, right? So if, let's say, rent is due on the first of the month, you don't pay it for within the first 5 days, then you're automatically in default and the landlord could terminate. And so we came up with this sort of a real estate portfolio wide strategy where, they were just being very strategic about how they were spending their money in cash. And so, the ones that didn't require notice, they paid those and, just drag their feet on the ones that required landlord notice before they're in default. And then as landlords were sending them notices telling them they didn't pay, then they would pay those and they would kind of handpick. And, it really, doesn't seem like a big deal, but it really saved the company a lot of money because it allowed them to stretch money, that was coming out of the business on the first of the month, every single month, to really stretch it out over a couple of months period as landlords were kind of, waking up to, hey, these guys aren't paying us. Let's, we have to send them a notice before we could try to kick them out. And so, making sure you understand what the lease says, is it just a grace period where, you have a few days to pay and then you're in default, or does the landlord have to send notice? And understanding that could be really a critical strategic piece of the lease later down the road if anyone runs into an issue. And then just quickly to touch on personal guarantees. In, I would say, the majority of the leases we work on here on the island, landlords would require at least one of the individual owners of a business to sign a personal guarantee. This is for a number of reasons, but the most obvious one is if the business fails and has no assets, the landlord wants to make sure they could go after an individual that may have some assets to collect the rent that the tenant is not paying. And a good guy guarantee is a common framework to help protect the guarantor against liability, where it essentially allows the guarantor out of the responsibility for the lease if it gives the space back to the landlord. So the concept came out of, hey, the tenant is being a good guy. They can't pay the rent, but they're not using the space anymore. So they're going to give it back. So the landlord could then try to lease it to someone else. So because they're being a good guy, they're giving the space back. The landlord cannot go after the individual guarantor for any late payments and unpaid rent and stuff like that. So that's a common way to manage personal risk as well when signing, when entering into a long-term lease. So surrender condition, we talked about removal of alterations. I touched on that as well. There's one thing that I wanted to mention, and that's maintaining the systems that serve the property, right? So typically in an office space, things like heating and cooling and electric and all that, that's part of the building framework when you get into it, right? So you're not really installing a lot of your own stuff. In other types of commercial spaces, whether it's retail or industrial or anything like that, a lot of times the tenant is responsible for maintaining all the systems that service their particular space. And what people a lot of times don't think about, is that maintaining that stuff also includes having to replace it if it breaks down. And if anyone's ever replaced an industrial heating and cooling system in a commercial building, those things, could cost upwards. I would say probably 50 to 70,000 on the low end to upwards of a few $100,000 for space of 10,000 plus square feet, right? And so that could be a huge cost if this stuff breaks down, right? And more critically, if it breaks down at the end of someone's lease, right? So let's say what happens is as the tenant, you're responsible for maintaining the HVAC system, making sure that you have hot air and cold air when you need it. Um, and the system breaks down in the last year of your lease. Well, now what you're doing is, since you have the blanket responsibility for maintaining it and replacing it when it goes down, now you're spending, potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars replacing something that will be brand new for the next guy, right? And there is no way to get value out of that whatsoever. And so, a lot of times, what we try to negotiate for is obviously, we try to mitigate this in one of several ways. One is if the cost is for actual replacement, then we try to put that on the landlord, because if the landlord is replacing it, they're going to get the value of having a building now with a new and improved system, and so they should be responsible for the replacement cost. But a lot of times, depending on the type of space in the lease, that may not be a viable option, and so the alternative is negotiate for some scaled down expense for the replacement if it happens in the tail end of a lease term, right? So if it happens in, let's say, the last year, the tenant is only responsible for maybe 20% of the cost. If it happens in the second, the penultimate year, then the tenant is responsible for 40%. If it happens in the third from the end year, then it's something a little more. And so just having some fair way to balance that cost is important to think about, because that stuff does happen, and it could be very untimely if it's a space that you're looking to get out of at the end of a lease.
We just have a question before you
Yeah, of
move
course.
on. Someone asked, does the good guy guarantee require the tenant to return the space completely empty and original fixtures?
Yeah, so that's going to depend on what the lease says, right? Typically, the lease will have language that says what is the condition of the space that has to be returned to the landlord, right? And sometimes it could be, just in its broom clean condition with all your furniture removed, right? In that case, all you got to do is take your stuff and leave, right? Sometimes there are going to be lease and repairs that need to be done, and there may also be lease and removal, not structural, but lease end stuff that the tenant put in that they would have to remove based on what the lease requires, right? And so, depending on what that looks like, really controls what the good guy guarantee responsibility is. If I'm the landlord, a typical good guy guarantee will say something like, you have to return it in the space that the lease requires, give us the keys, and and basically leave, right? If I'm the tenant, I'm negotiating for, just a broom clean condition with furniture removed, and trying to keep the good guy guarantee separate from the lease obligations, which is, where you could at least eliminate some of the construction that the lease may require be done at lease end.
And then someone said it's not quite a question, but I had an issue with my HVAC, but my insurance company told me they wouldn't fix it because I'm not the owner of the building and it's under landlord's policy. It was a very confusing situation, so I paid out of pocket.
Yeah, that does happen. Typically, a tenant liability insurance wouldn't cover the fixtures and the building systems, right? So I'm not surprised that a typical tenant liability insurance wouldn't cover it. A lot of times, when the commercial tenant is responsible for maintenance and repairs of the heating and cooling system or any other systems, the best way to manage that is to have uh, frequent and regular maintenance services, right? So landlords a lot of times will require that tenants enter into maintenance contracts for things like HVAC and other systems. And so, one way to mitigate the risk of having to replace something is to just frequently maintain it and make sure it's operating well. But yeah, I mean that stuff does come up, so it unfortunately it does, pop up once in a while. So just to kind of wrap up some of the stuff I've been talking about, the real cost of a lease is not just base rent, right? And if anybody takes anything away from, the the stuff that I covered today, it's really that, it's really looking deeper into what else is it that I'm going to be responsible for if I enter into this lease. I understand the base rent. I even understand that I have to pay for common charges and taxes and insurance and whatever else. But really understanding some, it, on a deeper level, to at least ask the right questions is something that's important to help manage unexpected things coming up, like having to pay for repairing or replacing an HVAC unit, when somebody, if the thing works, it works, right? But is it going to be working 7 years from now, or 10 years from now? And just being mindful of all these nuances that a typical commercial lease is, how it's structured, to make sure how every dollar is being spent. So that's really what I have for today. I'm happy to answer any questions and anything else that anyone may wish to talk about. So, feel free to chime in.
We have one more question. Someone, or two, someone said, is there initial walkthrough on condition of systems at the beginning of a lease and at the end of the lease?
Yeah, so depending on the type of space and the type of money invested, will probably you know, from my perspective, we would have different advice for doing that type of walkthrough. If it's, for example, we did a lease recently where one of our clients leased an entire building, about 30,000 square feet, and our recommendation was do a full mechanical assessment. Come in with an engineer, have them test every system before you sign the lease, so that you know exactly in what condition everything is, what works, what doesn't work. And landlords are often okay with that because they want to make sure that the tenant is happy. They don't want a tenant that comes in without knowing what is in the space, and then there's a huge cost, and it causes discourse and litigation potentially. And so, depending on the type of building, the type of space, whether the systems servicing the space are just for your space or being shared by others, a lot of these different factors will go into it. But I would absolutely recommend having a full engineer inspection done, for a large enough space where the systems are exclusive to the space.
And then we
Uh,
had someone said, what is a fair amount for a TI and free rent if a build out is substantial?
I don't know that there is. So just to explain, TI refers to tenant improvement allowance, right? So a lot of times landlords will offer, as part of lease negotiations, some dollars that they are contributing towards the cost of what the tenant will spend to build out their space, to make it usable for their particular purposes. And so I don't know that there is a fair amount. I think it really depends on, it varies town to town and market to market. But something along the lines of anywhere from $25 a square foot to $50 a square foot, is not unheard of, and that's the kind of stuff we see sometimes. It depends on, is the property in a particularly attractive, location, right? So is it, let's say there's a shopping center that's fully tenanted, and where there's no vacancy, and you're getting the one space, and there are five other people lined up behind you to take it if you don't want it. The landlord may be less willing to offer you an improvement allowance because they got five other guys lined up to maybe take it with less allowance. So I think it really depends on a lot of factors as to what really the market will be able to uh, be able to handle. At the same time, it could be that space has been on the market for a very long time, and the landlord would be happy to pay some extra money and invest in your build out to get you in there long term. So again, I think it really depends.
Hey, Arthur, I have a question. We work with a lot of startups that are looking around for space and to find the right cost and fit, for the business that they're doing. I tell you, some of the rates that I see out there, it gets me very concerned because they want to lock in something for a long time, but their prospect of success or failure, we're trying to de-risk that as much as possible. But if they sign a 3-year lease or a 5-year lease or whatever, and they are not able to, keep the business going after year 2, they're still responsible for the whole amount of the lease, right? That's a caveat to watch out for.
Yeah, and I think you bring up an interesting point. What happens, and I touched on the good guy guarantee concept and all that. So just to really expand on that a little bit more, what happens is if so every lease has a term, right? And that could be, that the term is month to month, right? Where you could get out at any time, but that's not common. That's, quite rare, I would say, in the commercial space. Typically, leases could be anywhere from, 1 to 2 years to upwards of 5 to 10 years, right? Where they're locked in. And if you don't pay rent or if you try to leave early, the tenant is responsible for all the rent through the end of the term, right? So if, let's say, in year 2, the business is just not what it was expected to be, and you're in a 10-year lease, the landlord is entitled to collect the entire 10 years, or in my example, 8 years worth of remaining term of rent, of additional rent, and and leases build in a lot of other costs that the landlord could, tack on to that, and litigate, and they would be successful on recovering a lot of that stuff. Now, this is where the guarantor and the good guy guarantee concept is, critical, right? Because let's say you're in an extreme scenario like the example I gave, where year 2 you're out of the space and you have 8 years remaining. Um, if the business is truly not doing well, then the entity that signed the lease, right? So let's say the business itself, the corporation, may not have anything left, right? It really, let's say it just failed, right? So it's got no assets. And so landlord's going to make a decision, are they going to, then sue a company that has no assets that they'll never collect from? Or are they going to go after the guarantor? And if the tenant gave the space back, then that's the best way to mitigate the risk from the tenant perspective on the responsibility for the remaining years on the term.
All right, good, good. Yeah, I've had a couple things, yeah, just with our building lease, a couple of surprises that came up, but talk about expenses. We had to pay for our own carting company, to take away the
Yeah,
garbage. The
the
other
the,
thing
the
that was a
trash removal. Yep.
surprise on operating expenses was I hate PSE&G demand meters. And I had no idea what it was until we got into the space. We had a machine shop. You go in, you turn on your air conditioner, you turn on all your machines at the beginning of the day, and it spikes the demand meter, and you pay a much higher
Yeah.
rate. So I think all this is hopefully it's been a real value add. Just think of everything that you can up front, and that's where Arthur,
Yeah, and there's a lot, right? I mean, I tried to, I tried to get a little bit below the surface today, but every space is unique and different, and everybody's situation is not the same, right? And so tried to kind of cover as broad of a base as possible, but really a lot goes into it, and there are a lot of nuances on this type of stuff where you just have to be, very cautious, right, when entering into a new lease relationship.
good, good. Kayla, anybody else we have that had an open question?
Someone said, let me just find it. Is there a way to rezone a residential space into a commercial space?
Uh, that's a good question. I would say that's probably outside of what I can give you a clear answer on. I have folks in the office that I work with that deal with land use and zoning and that sort of thing. So we could definitely talk about some of the specifics if there's a particular property in mind. But off the top of my head, I just don't know the answer and don't want to give you the wrong information.
And
All
then
right.
Hi,
Yeah,
Arthur.
Lori.
Arthur, hi. This is Willa Smith.
Hey,
How are
Willa.
you?
Yep, good to see you. How you doing?
Hi, thank you very much for your time today. I think Lori is asking about you, whether you offer a free consultation to review individual needs, because us here at the SPDC, all of our services are of no cost. So if you want to discuss your situation further with us, we don't provide legal advice, but we can shoot you in the right direction and get research for you. But Arthur, do you do like a consult with people at no cost, or
Yeah,
is
yeah. I mean, we so we're happy to connect with the Small Business Development Center and offer anybody that reaches out just to have a conversation and see if we could give some general advice on a situation. I think if it goes beyond that, then we could talk about what things could cost. But certainly happy to talk to anyone and spend some time to understand a particular situation and whether it's something we could help with or not.
okay? Great, thank
Good.
you. All right.
I think we're good, right? Anything else, Kayla? I don't see anything else in the chat, so
No, we're all good.
okay. Yeah, Arthur, thank you so much for the overview. This is like a really critical area. It's a big commitment for an individual, entrepreneur. So just want to get people educated to, ask the right question and everything else. I think you covered a lot of ground, in a short period of time. So thanks so much.
Great. Thanks for having me again. And, good luck to everyone. And again, anybody has any particular issue they want to just kick around, feel free to reach out. Happy to get on the phone, anytime.
Okay, thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you.